This video is brought to you by Artistworks. Artistworks are part of True Fire Studios, and they offer direct access to master musicians through their innovative online learning platform. Partnering with iconic musicians, they've crafted decades of industry experience into guided paths of online lessons. Crucially, there's an option to get personal feedback tailored specific to your playing via their unique video exchange. Get direct guidance towards your playing goals. You can use the code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of Artistworks courses. One of the things I like to kind of talk about on this channel are sort of things that represent what I think are a pretty good value for money. And on that note, I had often kind of talked about the Sire guitars that I've bought and a couple that they sent over on the channel. And it's been an area of interest for me going on and continues to be. And I'll probably feature more of them on the channel if I buy a few more, and I'll just keep it going because I'm interested to see this story. But I saw basically this confirmed a thing that I'd heard before as well. So I kind of thought that the Gibson Larry Carlton signature, I thought it was a bit odd that there are some specs that you can see on that where they say that it has a slim taper neck, and then others there says there's like a heavy kind of Larry Carlton profile. And I always thought, well, why does the Sire therefore have like a heavier neck? Because I thought that it would be the case that the Gibson was the more accurate kind of model with the slim taper. So if you've not tried one of these, it's quite a full kind of C, very similar to what you get on the Gibson Memphis series, the reissue with the blocks. That to me is pretty close to the feel of this guitar, as it happens. But it turns out the reason that Larry Carlton actually left Gibson was partly because they weren't promoting his model, and partly because he felt that there was inconsistency in the neck profiles. And it said this on the Cory Wong podcast. I'll just let that play for you.
Your signature guitar. Can you tell me a little bit about this? How did you develop this?
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's with Sire, S-I-R-E. And they approached me a few years back. I was no longer endorsing with Gibson. They really weren't promoting the Larry Carlton model. And most of the Larry Carlton models that came later with Gibson, they weren't consistent. The necks weren't exactly like mine. So we just called it quits. So a few years later, I was approached by Sire.
The Sire Larry Carlton, specifically the ES335 model, was based on his 69 Gibson ES335, which initially came with a trapeze tailpiece, and then he modified it to have Tune-o-matic. But basically Sire approached him, and I think he knew of them already because of the Marcus Miller Sire thing. Possibly not, but he certainly knows that story now. Which is also the same reason that I knew about Sire guitars, because I went to buy a bass and my options at the time were kind of Squire, because they got some really cool bass options, or Sire, and that sounds quite similar. But I'd seen that Marcus Miller had come out with this series of stuff that people were promoting online, and my friend Bill Banwell played one, you know, sort of really liked it. And so when it came time to buy a 5-string jazz bass, I bought one, and I found it to be really tip-top quality. And then when I saw that they came out with some guitars, I thought I'll buy a few of them. And in general, I've been a fan of them. Anyway, so that's the story. Basically, Larry Carlton got sent a few prototypes, I think between 5 and 7, and he liked the quality of the guitars, and then he sent his 69 off for them to copy, essentially. Now, that's a pretty cool story, I think. Now, in reality, the variations across the Sire stuff that I've tried, it's been not, I wouldn't say hit and miss, but although I think they've all played really pretty well, the areas where you find some kind of issues might be around some of the finishing. And I've seen comments online as well, and I just got sent an Instagram direct message the other day from a chap who had sort of like a crack in his the strap type in the wood on the neck pocket screw, right, and it would sort of crack the neck slightly. Now, these things do happen with mass-produced guitars. Now, I think the reason that Larry left Gibson, there's two things going on there, right? On the one hand, he's saying that Gibson aren't promoting his guitars very much. I don't know that they actually built that many of them anyway. If you think about the Gibson ES335, I think they probably don't make tons and tons of them, and particularly, like, it's not always that easy to find an ES335 in stock, in the UK at least, particularly signature models of them. For that reason, I don't think that his relationship with Gibson could have been particularly beneficial in financial terms. Whereas, if he's making a margin on every single Sire guitar sold, then this is going to be potentially, even though there's a lesser profit margin per guitar sold, he's going to be making way more money. And at this end of the market, far more people are going to be able to potentially try one. You know, the kind of person that can buy, and this is kind of where the thing that I just recently saw with Epiphone, they've just brought out this Dave Mustaine signature, which is like £1,400 to £1,600, and I think, like, is this the state of where guitars going, where even the supposed kind of slightly cheaper brands are starting to creep up? You know, your PRS SE models are getting towards the sort of £1,000 mark or beyond. The Epiphones are now sort of between the £1,500. I sort of thought that a Lazarus was expensive, and that was only £850. Do you know what I mean? Like, things are starting to really creep up. So Sire now, I think, are about £600 for the ES335 model, and you know, that neck profile, you've got to assume, is pretty close to Larry's. I think they're a decent proposition. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily changing the game or anything. I recently saw a Tim Pierce video on this, and I do think there are still plenty of other ES335 type guitars around this price range. Like Epiphone, I think, still make some really decent stuff, and I think Ibanez at this price range still makes some pretty decent stuff. The Sire stuff to me stands out in terms of playability because of how they basically roll the fret edges, which is not a thing that generally you do on cheaper guitars. This feels like a very comfortable neck. I think they've stopped using ebony fretboards as well, according to Larry, and now using rosewood on the ES335s. I have to say the P90 model that Sire actually sent to me to try was incredible. This one, the finishing is not as perfect, but in general, it's pretty good, and certainly playability-wise, it's decent. So I wouldn't say that the Sire stuff is necessarily mind-blowing, and if you're thinking about putting it up against the Gibson, I think it depends on what you're looking for. If you look at the real details, then I think you'd find that oftentimes the Gibsons are going to come out with better kind of, you know, the aesthetic kind of work. Whether or not playability wise, I found that the Sire Les Paul that I had, I felt like that played just as well as a Gibson Les Paul, which again sounds like a little bit strange to say, but that one I think is really good. That's coming back to me soon. It's been with Rick, my old music tech teacher, for a while to try it. Compared to the Tokai, I think this has been a bit heavy, and compared to the Gibson and Greco that I had, this was a bit heavier, and that was a thing that Tim Pierce said as well. Said about these cheaper guitars, sometimes they can come out a bit heavier. I'd be looking at as well, because if you go on this Sire owners group, you can see some people there that have had some other experiences as well. Like, it's one thing for people that are doing kind of paid YouTube demos, but you know, the real world experience I think is a little bit different in some cases. Like, I think sometimes because they've had to churn these out at a rate, there is sometimes some QC issues, but whether you overlook those or whether you just send it back and say, right, I'm gonna try another one, I think you could be pleasantly surprised at this kind of price range. And you can find them used as well, and you know, I'd encourage maybe give one of those a try. One other thing that Larry said was that he thinks that these are better than anything that Sire are making at the moment. I would say playability wise, or like the feel of the neck, I think so. But I've also found that the Sire stuff has been quite consistent. I've had a couple of the baritone paranormal series, and those were really consistent. I tried one of the 40th anniversary runs, and I thought that was really good for the money. And I think people really like the classic vibes. I'm not totally sure on that, because I feel like Sire have actually sort of upped their game quite a bit recently, and I think that QC wise they might be a bit tidier. Let me know your thoughts on that if you've found ones that are, you know, better, worse, or whatever. And I think some of the Sires are coming with some really nice pickups in them as well. So yeah, I'd like to know your thoughts on that. So that's essentially why Larry Carlton left Gibson, because basically their relationship had got to the point where they weren't really promoting his guitar, and he didn't feel like they were particularly necessarily that accurate. And it just so happens that Sire came along with, I think, guitars that are roadworthy. He's gigging them on the road. Of course, he's got the benefit of techs and probably gets sent the very best that Sire are capable of making. But I'm just a nobody, and I've bought ones that are really pretty good and do stand up quite well to playability sort of comparisons with some of the more expensive guitars. But I think have a bit of reasonable expectations about what a £600 guitar might look like. I think you're more likely to be happy than if you go into it expecting it to be like this Gibson destroyer.